Hello, this is part 2 of the talk on the recruitment and retention of transgender staff guidance for employers. My name's Declan O'Dempsey. I'm a barrister at Cloisters Chambers. That brings us to the Government Equality Office's guidance issued in November 2015. It extends to non-binary persons, so people who are of neither binary sex. It points to and tries to address the lack of awareness and understanding in relation to gender identity, and says that this sometimes results in an employer failing to support staff effectively. It tries to help employers by dealing with the lack of knowledge that exists about gender identity matters, and to give you a bit more confidence to engage in the process of supporting your staff. Page 7 sets out the business case. It's not my intention to go over that in this talk. There is one main legal exception that employers will need to consider in a limited number of cases. These are genuine occupational requirements. So you can apply in relation to work a requirement to have a particular protected characteristic if you can show that, having regard to the nature or context of the work, the requirement is an occupational requirement and the application of the requirement is a proportionate means of achieving a legitimate aim. And the code deals with this in chapter 4. However, you've also got to show that the person T does not meet the requirement, or, except in the case of sex, the employer, you have reasonable grounds for not being satisfied that the applicant or worker meets the requirement. Now, the language of all that is very broad because it's supposed to cover all of the protected characteristics under the Equality Act. However, the code clarifies that in the case of gender reassignment, the requirement will be not to be a transsexual person, and have a look at chapter 13 of the code for more details on that. The guide looks at recruitment and retention and considers some practical issues. You should, as an employer, consider your website and your branding to see whether that's inclusive, and equally whether your application forms are inclusive. Turning to that application process, forms should let people identify their gender as they choose, and if you ask for titles, you may want to provide other as an option. Some employers ask for previous names, but you should ask yourself whether you actually need to do that, and if you do, adopt a sensitive approach to acquiring that information and make sure that people appreciate that the information will be stored securely. Other aspects of recruitment that can cause difficulty include security and vetting, and the vetting and barring scheme. If you're an employer who's engaged in this area, a person with the characteristic of gender reassignment can apply to the email sensitive@dbs.gsi.gov.uk for further information on completing the form, so that it would be useful to have that information and the email address readily available. If you are monitoring for equal opportunities purposes, it's important, as always, that you stress that the monitoring is confidential. You should explain that the information is being sought for a particular reason in order to show the statistics, that it's confidential, and that it plays no role in recruitment decisions. Finally, on this point, it's important to distinguish the transsexuals, gender reassignment people, from lesbian, gay and bisexual people. Very often they're lumped together in the acronym LGBT, but in fact they have different needs, and you should make sure that your monitoring and your forms and indeed your application process distinguishes between the two. What do you do about HR? If you have human resources, then you should try to make sure that they are aware of the issues and that they're knowledgeable about what to do. There are going to be issues that arise in the case of a person who's undergone or is undergoing gender reassignment, such as a mismatch of names. So what should you do about this? Ideally, somebody in HR should be a point of contact. However, if you're not that big, or for whatever other reason, you could consider using an external consultant. And at the end of the guide, there's a useful list of organisations who could be contacted for information on this. Remember that knowledge and training in this area will minimise both Equality Act risks to the business, but also the data protection risk of inappropriate disclosure of status. I want to turn next to the interview or selection process. T may not wish to disclose their trans status at interview, and it's a question that should not be asked any more than questions about race or religion should be asked. It's also best not to assume someone's gender simply by their appearance. Well, what do you do if the candidate wants to talk about their transitioning or their status? If they advise the panel that it's their intention to transition, for example, you could consider how to handle this. So, for example, thank the candidate for talking about it, for being open. Explain that if appointed, you will, as employer, support them, but remain focused on the purpose of the interview. What you need to be considering is whether the person has the skills and experience for the job. Various issues arise in relation to job offers and documentation, particularly in relation to identity and documentation checks. So the names on a person's documentation, passport, driver's license, etc., they may not tally. T should have access to a nominated person in HR who's knowledgeable about these issues, and it can be available to deal with the documentation sensitively. Now, this involves retaining only what's needed, ensuring that data is held securely, and that there is no informal sharing of the information. That in itself could be unlawful. Remember, there are two issues to consider here. One is the issue of discrimination, but quite separately there's an issue of whether you'd be in breach of data protection requirements. Turning to induction, the issue that may arise is whether or not the person's status is to be discussed. The first rule is to leave it up to T to take the lead on it, because some people with gender reassignment status may be happy for some colleagues to know that they're trans, but not others. And you need to be careful about this, because even if T appears to open up about trans status, you've got to make sure that it's their decision who to share the information with. In particular, outing somebody as transsexual or with the characteristic of gender reassignment could be a potential criminal offence under the Gender Recognition Act 2004, resulting in a fine to you or the business. There's also the risk of exposure to discrimination claims. The key rule in relation to retention is the same as in any equal treatment situation. If people are unhappy or feel marginalised, or if they experience discrimination, there's a risk of grievances or complaints, or you may even lose a valued employee. And this can be terribly time-consuming, quite apart from the other human costs that are involved in dealing with those matters. I want to turn next to the way in which you could approach retaining somebody with gender reassignment as a characteristic. The whole point of making a plan. If the employer's not aware, it can be extremely difficult for T to approach their manager and tell them that they're planning to transition. So it's important to make staff aware as part of their equal ops training of the issues that can arise so that they can be approachable. So T may not know what the manager's response will be or how the organisational business would deal with the news. How do you offset that? Well, by having an inclusive approach generally and a culture that values difference. And in particular, the business should listen, show support and discuss levels of confidentiality and agree to seek advice and agree to work in partnership with T should T come forward. This leads to the concept of an action plan, because the process of transitioning is a process and it's one which needs to take place within the workplace. You ought really to try and agree an action plan with T. In this process, T, the employee, should lead as much as possible. You should take advice from HR. If you've got an inclusion and diversity team, so much the better, take advice from them. If you haven't, and if HR is not up to speed on this, then look to one of the external organisations. Again, these are mentioned at the end of the guide, so have a look at that. You need to understand that individuals could have a range of experiences or objectives. Some people prefer as few people as possible to know about their transition and decide to discuss it with their manager, but require nothing further to happen. On the other hand, T may be planning a medical intervention, and again, T may prefer a transition that doesn't involve any medical intervention or surgery, so that managers need to adopt an approach that meets that wide variety of needs that T may have. So agree with T what steps should be taken, so this is the action plan, and those are the steps before, during and after the transition. The guide provides you at page 28 with a template as to how to approach action planning. You should also have review meetings at a frequency and regularity that's agreed as part of the action plan. These should also occur at any significant stage of the process, so these could be fortnightly or monthly, depending on the individual and what's needed. However, it's not enough to have a fixed plan, and in fact it can be positively counterproductive to have a fixed plan. You should be prepared to update it and develop it, because for everybody involved it is likely to be a process of discovering what works and what does not. So there should be an agreement about where the plan and any meeting notes or anything else, any information on it, is to be kept and who has access to that information.